This is the core of chaos. My name's Julian Vane. Thank you very much for joining us on this course, which will explore chaos magic and theory and practice. Very good to have you here.
And welcome indeed. My name's Dave Lee, and David Lee sometimes, usually known as Dave Lee in this community. And yes, it's great to be presenting this.
We wanted to start, Dave, talking about the history of the IoT, and I have to bow to your seniority in terms of that story. And we also wanted to talk about the wider relationships of the IoT and more generally chaos magic practice and how that kind of has unfolded. But I guess we have to situate this a little bit in terms of the story, and perhaps we need to begin with like just a brief potted history of how you got involved with the chaos magic current, because we're talking about how many years ago now?
Oh, well, 40 odd years ago. Yeah, I mean, I was interested in magic at various times of my life. I was a science kid who was introduced to the practical consequences of magic by taking LSD in my late teens, and then went back to being a science kid and got a science degree. But in my mid-20s, I was ready to start doing some actual magical work. I was looking around. I met with a few people. I was a postgrad at Leeds University at the time. I met with a few people who were looking into magic, and of course, Leeds hosts the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which at that time was a bookshop. It's now a mail order service. I believe it still exists. But it was a little bookshop in a disreputable part of town. And it was absolutely wonderful. He walked in there and it was just, the weirdest books you'd ever seen, great incenses. The whole place smelt wonderful, as well as loads of sort of tacky Halloween style goods. And that was one of the nuclei around which chaos magic crystallized in a sense. And I picked up Liber Null, the 1978 edition of Liber Null, probably about a year after it came out, somewhere around 78, 79. And I thought, this is for me. This is definitely for me. This is magic for recovering science kids, people who are recovering from scientism, the sort of naive belief that science is much more than what it actually is. That it's our culture kind of accepts science in sort of naively in a sort of religious way. You've got everything is based on science, and some people will try and tell us that there's nothing else in the world except what you can show by scientific measurement. And of course, all of us in our hearts know that that is utter rubbish, and it's another cultural lie, just like most religions are. And so something that seemed to be written for people like me who wanted to get into magic, but were terribly skeptical about gods and angels and demons and all that sort of stuff, and spirits and all that kind of stuff. So, okay, here's something, just do something, start and do something, make something happen. And that was what magic was about for me. And Liber Null was the beginning of that.
That last point that you raised there is something that I always think about, the cultural context. So we're talking about the kind of, these ideas beginning their emergence in the latter part of the 1970s. And what's happening in that time? Several things. I mean, you have punk and that DIY kind of culture, be a performer, pick up a guitar. You too can be the Sex Pistols, that kind of thing. You have the collapse, to some extent, of the sort of modernity of post-World War II thriving economies. You have you have oil crises that start to happen at that kind of time. The Cold War is still kind of very much in evidence. And there's, I think also, as we think about Britain in particular, we think about the ascendancy of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government and the fact that that again created a whole series of grassroots resistance movements, of which I sort of feel that chaos magic is, the esoteric expression of some of those kinds of things. So what was going on in Britain with, the peace convoy and these various kind of the various cultures that were in opposition to what was seen as very much a fascist kind of state at the time. based on Pinochet's kind of economic and political model, that chaos magic is emblematic of that kind of time. There is an iconoclasm, an iconoclastic quality to it.
Mm.
And as you say, that there is this very strong emphasis on actually doing practice, and that's the thing that really matters.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it didn't emerge from nowhere. In terms of the actual writers involved, I think the two writers who were important even earlier than Pete Carroll and Lieber Knoll were Lionel Snell, aka Ramsay Dukes, and various other names at the time, who wrote SSOTBME in I think 1974. So
Mm.
this was a kind of multi-belief approach to magic. And of course, that in itself builds on Robert Anton Wilson's idea of multi-model agnosticism. So I think you've got two important streams there, one English and one American, that came into chaos magic. Although, chaos magic did seem to be a particularly British phenomenon at first, although of course it rapidly spread to other countries. Yeah.
There was that connection with the kind of Discordian movement and the idea of Eris and chaos and disruption, and those kind of elements I think were very present in it. But I think you're right to point out the work of Ramsay Dukes as being really kind of seminal in that, and also in what you've just said about that. For me, when I look at chaos magic and I look at the kind of the history of it, what I see is I see a style of magic that you described as appealing to kind of recovering science kids, a style of magic which tries to escape the kind of theocracy of a lot of the other kind of magical traditions that existed, certainly in Britain at the time. So if you think, what do we have? We have kind of Western esoteric tradition, ceremonial magic, that whole kind of servants of the light, W.B. Gray sort of stream of stuff, quite
Mm.
sort of transcendentalist, very based around the Kabbalah, astrology, the tarot, that sort of stuff. But with a strong kind of ethical dimension, some of which was quite Victorian in terms of its
Mhm.
ethics about various things, sexuality,
Mhm.
drug use, all those sorts of things. Then you had Thelema, which notionally was much more excitable as far as sexuality and drug use is concerned, but was also very much framed within this the religiosity of the time, that sort of that structure of Crowley is the prophet, there is a sacred book, we must learn these rituals and so forth. And then you had Wicca with its duo theology of God, goddess, essentially a sort of Freemasonry folkish kind of mashup of techniques, very very delicious in its own way, but also very much like the other two systems, one that has a sort of, as well as having magic as a repertoire of techniques, it has and this is what you should do and why you should do it and the ways that are good to do it and the ways that are off the menu to do it and so on. And chaos magic appeared to be trying to kind of escape from that somewhat.
Mm. I think chaos magic was well, some of the chaos magic writers were definitely influenced by Thelema, but on the other hand, if you got into organized Thelema, it was all, oh, you can only do this, you can only do that. If you join the OTO, I gather that you're only allowed to do Liber Resh for about the first 30 years or something, and or unless you've ascended the grades, that kind of thing. It's very, very restrictive idea of what magic was. And if you didn't get with that, if you didn't, if that didn't appeal to you, then that current wasn't a great deal of use to you. Whereas, as we've just said, with chaos magic, you just simply dive in and do something and see how that affected you. Move on and try something else.
So it's fundamentally like science in the sense that it's about experiment. It's about let's try these things out. Let's try out these techniques that we've found in various kind of different traditions. And there is a kind of this openness as well to the kind of multiplicity. We're talking about Britain becoming increasingly a multicultural nation at that stage, and the very beginnings of attempts at good inclusion of a greater diversity of voices were kind of happening at that point. So chaos magic allows you to sort of reach out to these different styles, incorporate them and utilize them and explore them, but not to fully buy into them necessarily, to consider them experiments in belief in particular, and the associated techniques of changing awareness that are connected with those different belief patterns.
Of course, yeah. This is emphasized by Robert Anton Wilson, multimodal agnosticism. You've got this emphasis on always being able to be critical of whatever reality tunnel, I think that was his coinage, you're in. So, when you're doing work that requires a scientific mind, then you're a scientist. When you're trying to report on what's happening in the world, you're stepping back from it a bit as in a journalistic way. If you're having an intense experience, like for instance, he uses examples of, being on psychedelics and so forth, then you really can't get the best out of that if you think about it in physics terms or legal terms. You need a magical or mystical framework in order to get the best out of the experience. And so with multimodal agnosticism, you've got a way of in, of experiencing and nurturing the richness of your life, of being able to nurture the richness of all the different levels of experience that you've got, rather than just be stuck in one, and moving from one belief system to another as a regular practice and as a conscious thing to do as well, because I think people do that in any event, but making that much more conscious.
And seeing then, in my mind, that makes me think of the classic piece of iconography of the chaos star. Depending on, no one quite agrees on the name of this thing anyway, which I quite like. The 8-rayed star of chaos, which of course has multiple rays, and this idea of expanding outwards in all directions. So with those, just thinking briefly about the kind of touching in on the history, both of kind of your personal experience and that sort of wider culture, what kind of experiments were being done in those early days? Because that's when obviously some of the great kind of advances happen, some of the great mistakes happen, and where people are really sort of pushing at the envelope of what's possible. So what kind of experimentation are we talking about
Mm.
with the magical work or the approaches to magic?
Well, I mean, if you pick up Liber Null, you've got what is basically a solo system there. It's for solo practice. You do some meditation, you do some habit changing, you do some sigilization, you keep a dream diary, that kind of thing. It's all solo stuff. So when we started, putting groups together, we didn't really know what to do. It was purely experimental. And the first group I was involved in was I think the first IoT stroke chaos magic group in UK, perhaps in the world. Actually, it was 1980, about this time of year, 1980, late 1980. And we decided to meet together in East Morton, which is this village near Bradford where Ray Sherwin lived, and Pete Carroll was also staying there. So we had a group which was, I think it was about 7 or 8 of us, agreed to try and meet together on the astral as a sort of Sabbath, a kind of astral Sabbath. And we went physically all went to a place in the Sunnydale, the hill that runs up from East Morton towards Ilkley Moor, and said, "Oh, we're going to meet back here." And Pete Carroll distributed doses of a flying ointment, supposed flying ointment with belladonna. He'd had an experience which was not. He didn't really want to repeat with belladonna after taking it orally, so thought he would, try out the topical application, and it wasn't actually that effective. I think I got interesting experience, but it definitely wasn't the astral savant. I definitely didn't go to that place. I think you need perhaps a lot more work on out of body stuff and lucid dreaming before you can get the best out of that kind of work anyway. And we were perhaps a little too soon. And then, so that wasn't a great start, but we kept the group going, and we only had about probably 5 or 6 meetings over about 18 months. And I mainly remember the last one, which was when we decided to wind the group up because it seemed to be getting a bit stuck. And but the next group that formed in 1984, which is the one that's known, I think Ray Sherwin might have referred to it as the Circle of Chaos, and so it got referred to as the Circle of Chaos, even though we just called it the group. That was a little bit more organized. We actually, we started trying to find some sort of baseline rituals that we could work with. And obviously one thing you need is a sort of general consciousness raising ritual. And we used the Bornless one. I actually memorized that at that stage, and we used that in a couple of kind of performances. And we did like to work out of doors. We had, we would meet in East Morton and then take about maybe half an hour, a bit more, to walk up into the hills and find a site. We eventually kind of settled on a couple of sites, which we reused a few times. Working at night out of doors, I mean, that in itself is a gnosis. Well, because one of the things that gets you high, gets you into a different state, enables your reality to change. Using the Bornless one, building a large fire sometimes, and right from the start, looking at different dosages of psychedelics, like kind of small dosages of psilocybin mushrooms, for instance, and seeing how that went. So those are the kind of experiments we were engaged in at the time, trying to find a chaos liturgy and trying out the various psychoactives and working in the woods.
It sounds very pagan,
Yeah.
in many respects, and deliciously science specific. It also sounds very much like, I'm guessing, at the sort of, um, uh, as a band of musicians start to come together and jam and try to figure out things. And of course, the first couple of sessions are unlikely to be the best. But then as we riff off each other and as we start to kind of build a culture and start to build an approach to magic, it the structure sort of self-assembles itself. One of the things I find interesting about chaos magic is that it's a style or an approach to magic which can be easily understood kind of historically and culturally, and where you can kind of see it in its own process of evolving, of self-creation. And it definitely has that kind of lineage of magical practice. It is, if we were talking in academic terms, it sits as part of the Western magical tradition, broadly speaking. And it's connected, as you say, to Thelema. If you go to things like Liber Null and start to go through it, you find that there are huge amounts of material that are borrowed, shall we say, often generally without citation, from other writers. So it is very much part of that tradition, but it's a tradition which is reimagining itself and trying to be, I guess, in some respects, a bit postmodern, which is a term that we haven't
Yeah.
used yet. So there is that idea, I think, of, in this period of the latter part of the 20th century, we're getting this idea of, multiple discourses, what is being described by Robert Anton Wilson as reality tunnels, this idea of like multiplicity of perspective, and to be able to kind of step out of this is how things should be done and try and discover how things might be done is the real difference. Although, of course, in Liber Null, we still have that page, my favorite page of Liber Null, sort of right at the beginning. Here's this book, 1978, which kind of conjures the IoT, the magical pact of the Illuminants of Thanateros, into existence. So it's a very effective spell.
Mm.
And it has that delicious flow diagram that sort of has
Yes.
shamanism at the top, and then all these other things flowing down. And it's like saying, okay, so look, we're part of the storyline, but we're doing something new. So it's like saying we're part of the artistic tradition, but um, uh, our project as the surrealists, as the chaos magicians, is something that is also simultaneously a radical break with some of at least how we perceive this lineage to be.
Mm. Absolutely, yes. I always enjoyed that chart as well. I think one of the intriguing things about the early history of it as well is the way that we didn't really know what to enchant for a lot of the time. That's something that went on for quite a few years. That wasn't just the first few meetings. It was, what are you actually enchanting for? I mean, some of the things I remember the most from the early meetings of those two groups was initiation, trying to find a way of initiation, trying to find a way which we could initiate each other into belonging in a group so that we would form a collective. And there were some vivid moments of that. We each took kind of theatrical roles, and then, the person who's being initiated would be kind of would be the center of a drama in which we were all playing weird roles. And sometimes you had weird effects. Like, for instance, the first time that I had a kind of recorded instance of telepathy was during somebody's initiation, where we were all sort of, this guy, he's tied to a tree, he's he's in an altered state of consciousness, and various like scenarios are being played out in front of him. And one of them was that we're throwing sigils and stuff at him. We're throwing different kind of psychic impulses at him. And in one sort of pause in that, I had this really crystal clear sense of a sigil, a circle with a wiggly line through it and another line. And so at the end, when we were doing our the feedback, a debriefing part of it all, I sort of drew that and said, anybody recognize this? And Pete Carroll said, oh yes, that's what I was hurling at him. So it's kind of like we were blundering about discovering things. It was very interesting. And it wasn't for some years really, it was some years really before we were able to collectively enchant for particular things outside of our own sphere of influence. In a way, a lot of it was remarkably lacking in the results magic approach that chaos magic is so famous for. That didn't really come in on individual work. It did, of course, but group work, it took a while before that crystallized.
That's really interesting. And it's interesting to have the desire to start with initiation, given what we said about wanting to kind of radically break with the past, where one of the things that we notice about that is hugely complex and baroque forms of initiation through the various grades of the Kabbalah or the various kind of levels of whatever the system is. And yet when we find ourselves attempting to kind of break with this, one of the things that we do is say, well, we must be initiated in order to do this. So again, it's like looking for that authority. And then, of course, realizing, I'm guessing, as we go through this process, that actually, of course, particularly given the nature of chaos magic, the authority comes primarily from the practice. It comes from having time exploring these things, being uncertain, learning more, and exploring and experimenting.
Indeed.